Welcome to a lecture series on tourism. Time zones are an important aspect in travel and tourism, especially in intercontinental travel. In this module, we will analyze this interesting concept and examine how it influences travel involving many countries. We will classify it under the following heads, namely time zone, an overview, history of timekeeping, the International Meridian Conference 1884, time zones in the 20th century, daylight saving time. We hope it gives you an overall perspective of this complex subject and enables you to understand and appreciate its critical role.
Time zones, an overview. Let us begin with a basic definition of time zones. A time zone is an area on Earth which has the same standard time for legal, commercial, and social purposes. Geographically, the Earth is longitudinally divided into many time zones, each with a uniform time of its own. Each zone is 15 degrees of longitude in width with local variations, and observes a clock time which is 1 hour earlier than the time zone directly to the east. In other words, local time is 1 hour ahead of each time zone as one travels towards east, and 1 hour behind for each time zone as one travels west. The International Meridian Conference in 1884 established the prime meridian as the starting point and divided the Earth into 24 time zones. However, the number of standard time zones is debatable and discussed among various sources, particularly with regards to the international dateline. The prime meridian is basically a line of longitude which is reckoned to be the 0 degrees, and the meridian opposite to the prime meridian on the globe is the 180 degrees in a 360-degree system, which divides the Earth into two hemispheres, eastern and western. In other words, this 180th meridian or the anti-meridian is the meridian which is 180 degrees east or west of the prime meridian. The International Meridian Conference 1884 decided the prime meridian passed through the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, in southeast London in the UK. Thus, the prime meridian came to be known as the International Meridian or the Greenwich Meridian. Similarly, the conference decided that the 180th meridian will be used as the basis for reckoning the date, and hence it was referred to as the International Dateline, where the travelers change date. Traveling eastward across the line, one subtracts 1 calendar day. Traveling westward, one adds a day. The dateline is necessary to avoid confusions that would otherwise result. History of timekeeping. Before clocks were invented, people reckoned time by watching the movement and position of the sun with the help of devices like the sundial. Many cities across the world historically kept their own time by using some type of instrument to observe the sun's zenith at noon. The earliest time measuring devices used either the sun's shadow or the rate in which water or sand flows out of a vessel. The pendulum clock was developed during the 17th century. These clocks were sufficiently accurate to be used at sea to determine longitude and for scientific time measurement in the 18th century. English horologist John Harrison proved in 1764 that a clock could be used to locate a ship's position at sea with extraordinary accuracy. Chronometers, which measure time accurately in spite of motion or varying conditions, became popular instruments among many merchant mariners during the 19th century. Still, even after developments regarding longitude, many towns and cities set clocks based on sunsets and sunrises. Dawn and dusk occur at different times, but time differences between distant locations were barely noticeable prior to the 19th century because of long travel times and the lack of long-distance communications. The use of local solar time became increasingly awkward as railways and telecommunications improved. Time zones were therefore a compromise, relaxing the complex geographical dependence while still allowing local time to be approximate with mean solar time. Challenges in the 19th century: trade, communications and transport became more globalized during the 19th century, which made it necessary that all maps and charts should indicate the same longitudes in whichever country they were produced, as being so many degrees east or west of a prime meridian. Moreover, the international telegraph needed at least a single standard to which all local times could be referred. The first person to propose a worldwide system of time zones was the Italian mathematician Quirico Filopanti in his book Miranda, published in 1858. However, his idea was unknown outside the pages of his book until long after his death. Therefore, it did not influence the adoption of time zones during the 19th century. Filopanti proposed 24 hourly time zones, which he called longitudinal days. The first one centered on the Meridian of Rome. He also proposed a universal time to be used in astronomy and telegraphy. Canadian Sir Sandford Fleming proposed a worldwide system of time zones in 1879 that we use today. He was one of the key players in developing a globally acceptable system of timekeeping. He advocated the adoption of a standard or mean time and hourly variations from that in accordance with established time zones. He recommended that the world be divided into 24 time zones, each spaced 15 degrees of longitude apart. Since the Earth rotates once every 24 hours and there are 360 degrees of longitude, each hour the Earth rotates 1/24th of a circle or 15 degrees of longitude. Sir Fleming's time zones were hailed as a brilliant solution to a chaotic problem worldwide. He also helped convene the International Meridian Conference in 1884, where the International Standard Time System was adopted. However, once railroads began to operate and move people rapidly across great distances, time became much more critical. In the early years of the railroads, the schedules were very confusing because each stop was based on a different local time. The standardization of time was essential to efficient operation of railroads. United States railroad companies began utilizing Fleming's standard time zones on November 18, 1883. In 1884, an International Prime Meridian Conference was held in Washington, D.C. to standardize time and select the prime meridian. The conference selected the longitude of Greenwich, England as 0 degrees longitude and established the 24 time zones based on the prime meridian. American railroads maintained many different time zones during the late 1800s. Each train station set its own clock, so it was difficult to coordinate train schedules. Time calculation became a serious problem for people traveling by train, sometimes hundreds of miles in a day, according to the Library of Congress. Every city in the United States used a different time standard, so there were more than 300 local sun times to choose from. Railroad managers tried to address the problem by establishing 100 railroad time zones, but this was only a partial solution to the problem. Operators of the new railroad lines needed a new time plan that would offer a uniform train schedule for departures and arrivals. 4 standard time zones for the continental United States were introduced on November 18, 1883. Britain, which already adopted its own standard time system for England, Scotland and Wales, helped gather international consensus for global time zones in 1884. By about 1900, almost all time on Earth was in the form of standard time zones, only some of which used an hourly offset from GMT. Many applied the time at a local astronomical observatory to an entire country without any reference to GMT. It took many decades before all time on Earth was in the form of time zones referred to some standard offset from GMT, UTC. Most major countries had adopted hourly time zones by 1929. Nepal was the last country to adopt a standard offset, shifting slightly to UTC plus 5.45 in 1986. Although the time zones had been established, not all countries switched immediately. Though most US states began to adhere to the Pacific, Mountain, Central and Eastern time zones by 1895, Congress didn't make it mandatory to use these time zones until the Standard Time Act of 1918. This act standardized the time zones, resulting in 9 time zones in the US and its territories, which include Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific, Alaska, Hawaii, Aleutian, Samoa, Wake Island and Guam. The International Meridian Conference 1884. The International Meridian Conference at Washington, D.C., USA adopted a proposal in October 1884. The proposal stated that the prime meridian for longitude and timekeeping should be one that passes through the center of the transit instrument at the Greenwich Observatory in the United Kingdom, UK. The conference therefore established the Greenwich Meridian as the prime meridian and GMT, the Greenwich Mean Time, as the world's standard time. The international 24-hour time zone system grew from this, in which all zones referred back to GMT on the prime meridian. The main factors that favored Greenwich as the site of the prime meridian were: Britain had more shipping and ships using the Greenwich Meridian than the rest of the world put together at the time. The British Nautical Almanac started these charts in 1767. The Greenwich Observatory produced data of the highest quality for a long time. Time zones in the 20th century. Interestingly, many French maps showed 0 degrees at Paris for many years despite the International Meridian Conference's outcomes in 1884. GMT was the universal reference standard, all other times being stated as so many hours ahead or behind it. But the French continued to treat Paris as the prime meridian until 1911. Even so, the French defined legal time as Paris Mean Time minus 9 minutes and 21 seconds. In other words, this was the same time as GMT. France did not formally use UTC Coordinated Universal Time as a reference to its standard time zone UTC plus 1 until August in 1978. Standard time in terms of time zones was not established in United States law until the Act of March 19, 1918, sometimes called the Standard Time Act. The Act also established daylight saving time in the nation. Daylight saving time was repealed in 1919, but standard time in time zones remained in law, with the Interstate Commerce Commission (ICC) having the authority over time zone boundaries. Many countries adopted hourly time zones by the late 1920s. Many nations today use standard time zones, but some places adopt half-hour deviations from standard time or use quarter-hour deviations. Moreover, countries such as China use a single time zone, even though their territory extends beyond the 15 degrees of longitude. Time zones today. Given a 24-hour day and 360 degrees of longitude around the Earth, it is obvious that the world's standard time zones have to be 15 degrees wide on average. It is worth mentioning that some sources claim there are 24 standard time zones, while others say there are 25 time zones. The perspective of the number of time zones depends on the definition of a time zone versus the international dateline. When well-regulated mechanical clocks became widespread in the early 19th century, each city began to use some local mean solar time. Apparent and mean solar time can differ by up to around 15 minutes, as described by the equation of time, due to the non-circular shape of the Earth's orbit around the Sun. Mean solar time has days of equal length, and the difference between the two averages to zero after a year. Greenwich Mean Time (GMT) was established in 1675, when the Royal Observatory was built as an aid to English mariners to determine longitude at sea, providing a standard reference time, when each city in England kept a different local time. Before 1972, all time zones were specified as an offset from Greenwich Mean Time (GMT), which was the mean solar time in the Meridian passing through the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, London. Since 1972, all official time services have broadcast radio time signals synchronized to UTC, Coordinated Universal Time, a form of atomic time that includes leap seconds to keep it within 0.9 seconds of this former GMT, now called UT1. Some higher latitude countries use daylight saving time for part of the year, typically by changing clocks by an hour. Many countries now legally define their standard time relative to UTC, although some still legally refer to GMT, including the United Kingdom itself. UTC, also called Zulu time, is used everywhere on Earth by astronomers and others who need to state the time of an event unambiguously. Today, all nations use standard time zones for secular purposes, but they do not all apply the concept as originally conceived by Sir Fleming. Newfoundland, India, Iran, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Burma, the Marquesas, as well as parts of Australia use half-hour deviations from standard time, and some nations such as Nepal and some provinces such as the Chatham Islands use quarter-hour deviations. Some countries, most notably China and India, use a single time zone, even though the extent of their territory far exceeds 15 degrees of longitude. Before 1949, China used 5 time zones. Since time zones are based on segments of longitude and lines of longitude narrow at the poles, scientists working at the North and South Poles simply use UTC time. Otherwise, Antarctica would be divided into 24 very thin time zones. The time zones of the United States are standardized by Congress, and although the lines were drawn to avoid populated areas, sometimes they have been moved to avoid complication. With the growth of the Internet and global communication and commerce, some have advocated a new worldwide time system. According to sources such as the Canadian Encyclopedia, Sir Sandford Fleming was one of the key players in developing a globally acceptable system of timekeeping. He supported the adoption of a standard or mean time and hourly variations from that in accordance with established time zones. He also helped convene the International Meridian Conference in 1884, where the International Standard Time System was adopted. Daylight Saving Time. Daylight Saving Time, often referred to as DST or summer time, is a way of making better use of the daylight in the evenings by setting the clocks forward by 1 hour during the longer days of summer and back again in the fall. This practice normally begins in the Northern Hemisphere between March-April and ends between September-November. Standard Time begins in the Northern Hemisphere between September-November and ends between March-April. Daylight Saving Time begins in the Southern Hemisphere between September-November and ends between March-April. Standard Time begins in the Southern Hemisphere between March-April and ends between September-November. Many countries in the Southern Hemisphere may observe DST. Why observe DST? Many countries observe DST and many do not. Many countries use DST to make better use of the daylight in the evenings. Many people believe that DST could be linked to fewer road accidents and injuries. The extra hour of daylight in the evening is said to give children more social time and can boost the tourism industry because it increases the amount of outdoor activities. DST is also used to save energy and reduce artificial light needed during the evening hours. Clocks are set 1 hour ahead during the spring and 1 hour back to standard time in the autumn. However, many people disagree on energy savings due to DST, while some argue it is beneficial. It is difficult to predict what will happen with daylight saving time in the future. The daylight saving date in many countries may change from time to time due to special events or conditions. The United States, Canada, and some other countries extended DST in 2007. The new start date is the second Sunday in March, previously the first Sunday in April, through to the first Sunday in November, previously the last Sunday in October. A brief history of DST. Benjamin Franklin first suggested daylight saving time in 1784, but modern DST was not proposed until 1895 when an entomologist from New Zealand, George Vernon Hudson, presented a proposal for a 2-hour daylight saving shift to the Wellington Philosophical Society. The conception of DST was mainly credited to an English builder, William Willett, in 1905, when he presented the idea to advance the clock during the summer months. His proposal was published 2 years later and introduced to the House of Commons in February 1908. The first daylight saving bill was examined by a select committee but was never made into a law. It was not until World War I in 1916 that DST was adopted and implemented by several countries in Europe, which initially rejected the idea. Today, it is almost always 1 hour ahead, but throughout history, there have been several variants on this, such as half adjustments 30 minutes or double adjustment 2 hours, and adjustments of 20 and 40 minutes have also been used. A 2-hour adjustment was used in several countries during the 1940s and elsewhere at times. A half adjustment was sometimes used in New Zealand in the first half of the 20th century. Australia's Lord Howe Island UTC plus 10.30 follows a DST schedule in which clocks are moved 30 minutes forward to UTC plus 11, which is Australian Eastern Daylight Time AEDT, when it is on DST. Sometimes DST is used for a longer period than just the summer, as it was in the United States during World War II. From February 3, 1942 to September 30, 1945, most of the United States had DST all year. It was called wartime.
Well, we have seen how time zones have created standardized procedures for measuring time in travel across continents. And with that, we come to the end of the session. Thank you.